My name is Wilson Alvarez. I'm a permaculture instructor, and for the last year I have been helping at this Horn Farm Center, which is a nonprofit that deals with regenerative agriculture, and now we've moved into restorative practices for woodlands. The landscape is missing so many pieces, the moving pieces of the landscape. There's a lot of the pieces that are the non-moving pieces, which are the trees and plants and water and soil. But a lot of the moving pieces that actually move sediment and soil and they move nutrients across, they're missing, and that's the animals. So what we're doing is trying to create a new restoration process based off of extinct animals and extant animals. Extant means animals that still exist. They aren't gone from the planet, but they are not here anymore. They've been extirpated from Pennsylvania. And we're using what they do mechanically on the landscape. We're replicating that and trying to create a more natural disturbance regimen that replicates as close as we can to what would naturally be here if we had all the pieces together. Just think about a machine that has a few cogs missing. And it's not a few of the small cogs, it's the larger pieces that are missing, the moving pieces that are missing. And while we live in a very non-brittle environment that rains all the time and there's tons of plants that come out, we see that as regenerative. But every time that it grows and there's a disturbance that the landscape doesn't understand, like a road, for example, or a building, a big bulldozer that actually changes hydrology. It's putting sand into the gears, really, it's what it's doing. It slows down regenerativeness, moves water in places where it's not supposed to. So by putting back the elements that belong there, we're hoping to get a more regenerative landscape and restoration process than exists right now. There's a lot of idealism involved when you get into regenerative practices and sustainable farming and all that. There's an elephant in the room, which is population. We cannot talk about a regenerative future with an exponential growing population. Those two don't live in the same world. We already are at a well beyond carrying capacity of humanity. We outstrip the environment twofold, threefold, fourfold. They say we need 2 planets already. So we can't have a conversation about the next 100 years without talking about today. We're at 7 billion. I see very idealistic and also very smart people say very interestingly dumb things. Scientists and biologists have always used carrying capacity for other mammals, and that's across the board. A certain amount of landscape with a certain amount of animals, good carrying capacity, everyone's healthy, everyone's fed. We don't put that same lens on us, and that's a very dangerous thing to do. We see ourselves as special. We see ourselves as gods almost, because what we have done and what we continue to do. We can build these mammoth structures and we look at them and we go, see, we're different. But I don't see ourselves as different. An elephant is also an ecosystem engineer, is that they actually manipulate their environment to fit their needs. And elephants create the entire savanna ecosystem by knocking down trees, and then all the assemblies of zebras and wildebeest can then live around the savanna that the elephant designs. So yes, we are special. But we are not special in the way as God is special. We're very interesting in that we can mimic anything. I think that's our gift, is the mimic. We can act like a wolf, we can act like a beaver, we can act like an elephant, we can act like anything. We can also act like a geological force too. We've gone beyond mimicking animals. We can mimic hurricanes, we can mimic lava flows, we can mimic all of it. So taking that idea and saying, well, what are we doing to the planet around us? It's not positive. We have created so many taboos for ourselves culturally, and not just the United States, but across the world. And even not in such extremes, when we move into what's acceptable and what's not, but we can't talk about population. No one can tell someone else how many children they can have. That is still a very taboo subject. And I'm not saying we have to do anything extreme, but maybe de-incentivizing the idea of having more children. That might be a good step. Culturally changing the idea of what is acceptable, how many children are acceptable. Maybe we can make a 100-year plan for shrinking our places, making more incentive for having less children or no children, right? These are the things that we can do without having to have these extreme ideas of, well, who chooses? We choose together. It's not, no one is going to be pulling the strings here on population control, but we are a smart enough species that we can have the conversation. But I think if we took population into control and started education of women especially, their rights, birth control and controlling their rights for reproduction, and not having culturally tell them what's appropriate or not, that's a humongous step forward in where we could be in 100 years from now. I think how we got here is not a mistake. I wouldn't say a mistake, but I think our story is long. When you look at our history 1,000,000 years ago, and 100,000 years ago, you have multiple species of Homo sapien. You have Homo neanderthal, you have Homo habilis, and you have about 200,000 years ago, you get Homo sapien. Now, Homo sapien is this very interesting species that seems to have had an advantage, not of a larger brain, because Homo neanderthal had a larger brain than us, but as far as we have this special something where we can take what we see and turn it into a tool. So they call humans this tool makers. But I think that kind of isn't it. I think what the base of it is we take the shape of a shark tooth. We say, how can we make that with something else? And we turn that into an arrowhead made out of stone. So it's a mimic process is what we're doing. By doing that, we move the cross landscapes faster than evolution. So if a wolf is moving from the south to the north, it's multiple generations that has to have its fur get thicker, claws have to get harder, teeth bigger, growth larger. With us, instead of going through that evolutionary process of forming baseline with our ecosystems, we moved so quickly by taking their fur, building so we could stay furless and have fur, move north and south and east and west at such a rapid pace. And I think that has led us to where we are now. If you think of a child with all the best intentions are kind of clumsy, in the best way, but clumsy. And I think we are evolutionarily children in a lot of ways. We never had to form, when you get to a grown-up, you talk to your neighbors and do this and figure everything out and the politics of all of it. But by moving across landscapes and being able to dominate as we do, we never had to do that. It was only after the end of the Ice Age that there was no more places to go, that you see this settling and you see the beginning of pastoralism, sedentary hunter-gatherism, and agriculture. So how we got here is a long story. But where we go from here is the next story. And either we can continue on the path that we are now, continue to try to dominate the landscape and the ecosystem, or we could change now. We could move to more perennial systems, restore forests, restore wetlands, restore habitats, and at the same time producing food sources in a whole new way. Most people now live in cities. 60% of all people on the planet live in cities. So we're already one step removed from the landscape. And most people are 2, 3, 4 steps removed from the landscape. To have people who have never even been in the landscape begin to start to think about large equipment. Large equipment have this double thing. They can create ponds 10 times faster than humans can, but at the same time, in the hands of someone that doesn't know what they're doing, they could destroy the planet 10 times faster than humans can too. There also is this concept called emergy, which is embodied energy. So how much energy it took to create the tools that you're using. Hand tools, by their very definition, are very low energy tools. Very little bit of metal, very little bit of wood, very little bit of processing comparative to a bulldozer, a gasoline chainsaw. Think about plastic from here, metal from here, iron ore being mined. All this stuff has a caloric expenditure. By buying a brand new tool, you go, oh, see, I'm more efficient. But you haven't taken into account the embodied energy in that tool. So by using small scale hand tools, you get rid of a lot of that embodied energy. You start to think of caloric energy. A gallon of gasoline, they say, has 31,000 calories equivalent. If a human can ingest a gallon of gas, they could ride a bicycle 916 miles. But what they don't take into account, that 31,000, is the embodied energy of the gasoline itself. Even if you get rid of embodied energy, the efficiency of the tool, a gallon of gas doesn't go very far inside of a tool, a bigger tool, because you have to move around this excessive weight and move it around. Where with a hand tool, 2 or 3 people might do 500 calories doing what that caterpillar can do, but it's always going to be less caloric expenditure using human energy. And just efficiency of the way we move in a bipedal way, we can get into these places where tracked vehicles or even wheeled vehicles, they're not even able to get into. So we're able to do precise work and large-scale work without using animal husbandry and without using large tools that have large embodied energy inside of it. And it also allows us to do this work in a way that doesn't destroy baseline. We're sitting out here, there are birds chirping and there are things like that. If we were using a chainsaw out here, that destroys baseline for a very long period of time. So we're able to work out here while the birds chirp, while the fox moves across, make a smaller impact on the environment, because we're already working in environments that have been impacted significantly by humans. I think from me being here and having hundreds of people be here throughout this last year, the biggest thing is getting your hands on the soil, on the plants, on the trees. There's this connection that you get, which you can't get from hiking through or camping out, because there's always this disconnect between you and the landscape. You're an observer, and when you're this camper with your big backpack, you're an astronaut. You bring all your civilized world into this forest area and you use it for your own enjoyment. Where this work is so different, you become connected to what is actually happening on the landscape. A vine is killing this tree, I take it out. You can almost feel the tree go, whew. This water is causing a channeling, which is causing soil erosion. I drop a tree down, which will stop that from happening. I am an active participant in this forest, which is a gift that I'm allowed to do that the earth still allows me to do it. And 2, it gives me more buy-in into the landscape. So then I feel like I'm part of it. And this is not true of just me. This is true of almost anyone that can touch the landscape. A lot of us remember building forts in a little wild space, or playing in the creek and building dams when we were young. But there's a whole new group of people who haven't grown up that way. There's even more disconnected from the landscape than ever before. So having places like this, these semi-wild lands, these places that are neither wild nor domesticated, they're sort of this in-between places. They're just assemblies along roadsides, along rivers that we all have in all of our towns. These are the lands that you can go into, touch, move, feel, be a part of. There's that Japanese idea of forest bathing, where you go into a forest and allow the forest to clear your mind. But it still feels like it's a human getting a product from a landscape without giving anything back. And I like to be able to give back. It's a very reciprocal relationship. We know how to produce food. We know how to manipulate land. We know how to do that. We're very good at it. We just haven't been doing it in the right ways, in the right places, at the right frequencies. We're trying to create an experimental plot where all the techniques that exist for agroforestry, for restoration, go into a pot, and we use them together. Finding those frequencies that work for this specific area is sort of the experiment here. And then once we have a really good toolkit that is usable anywhere in the world, so if you live in the Kalahari or if you live in New Zealand, creating a way for you to look at the landscape and say, what is missing? What did it do? And how can I do that? See the animals that either exist there now but are not there, or have existed there in the past and played a vital role. So instead of 7 billion humans acting like humans, if a couple million of us stopped acting like humans and start acting like the animals that are extinct or not in our area, the ecosystem has a way of regenerating with that. So all we have to do is train people to look at the landscape in a different way, seeing how they could reproduce what's not there in a mechanical level, and then the ecosystem will take care of itself. And that's been one of my challenges. I'm a designer. My whole thing is stopping myself from designing, just making the disturbance on the scale that an animal would, and then backing off and saying, okay, what is the ecosystem going to do with this specific disturbance? And that has been my challenge, but that is going to be the challenge for every human as we move along. So moving into the idea of what the future looks like, you can have two futures. One is an annual future and one is a perennial future. There's a lot of money and energy going into what the future of annual vegetables look like. These techno fixes, which are these like huge skyscrapers that grow crops in controlled environments and hydroponics and all the rest. Do I think that solves anything? I don't. I think it exacerbates the issue that we already have of we're trying to dominate an ecosystem, and it just gets worse from there. Where our perennial future, starting to move into the idea of creating ecosystems with perennials, trees, and moving into a space of agriculture that is long-term. We do that in some things. Our apples and peaches and pears and everything that you can grow on a tree, we're used to that type of thing. Chestnuts, for example, we're treated as grain. Right now, if we just grew grass on an acre, that acre is just 1 acre. But if we grew grass on that acre and then put trees on top that still allows the grass to grow, we have another layer of food production on that same thing. Now, if you put vines that grow up that also was a food producer, now you have 3 layers of food producing. So instead of having 1 acre of food, you have 3 acres of food.
We've basically been 2D farming.
Absolutely.
Right,
absolutely. It could be 3D farming. And then we're not getting the ecosystem services that wild systems produce. Wild systems produce all the air that we breathe, all the water that we produce, and all the biomass and carbon sequestration, which is one of the big ones for today. We've already broken the climate in a way that no matter what we do now, it's going to change. It's going to get drier or wetter or hotter. So we have to have this very adaptable food system where perennials are just more adaptable because of their root systems. They can deal with drought better, where annuals are just by their very nature not very adaptable to change. And we just been living in this 10,000 year beautiful window of very stable ecosystems. And that is not the norm for our planet. The norm for our planet is very raucous all over the place through ice ages or long droughts. We have had this spot where annual agriculture could even exist. That's not going to work for very long, and it's not really working that well. Only through subsidies do we see these large-scale farms. We have to do this strategy of thinking about climate change, thinking about carbon sequestration, thinking about food production, what the future could look like. We need to combine those into a regenerative, perennial systems that produce all the ecosystem services that wild systems do, but also produce all the food that we need. That's going to take an effort on everyone's part. The consumer to ask for these products, and for the growers to grow them before there's a market for them. And that's the hard part, because we can't keep designing systems for the system that we have that we know is broken. We have to design systems that are experimental for the world that we are trying to build. Everyone gets scared of that gap. that's sort of what we're trying to do here. Is we're trying to create a whole new style of agriculture where we're restoring an ecosystem at the same time producing food.